Hi, it's Andy from PCR Global with another one of our risk management videos from our A to Z series. Today's letter is I and the subject is insider threat. What are we going to cover? What is an insider threat? How and where insider threat can be noted, and how insider threat fits into wider risk management. What is insider threat? So definition, groups, size of the problem, and we'll have a quick look at the Morrisons case. So what is insider threat? Well, according to the CPNI, which is the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure in the UK, CPNI defines an insider as a person who exploits or has the intention to exploit their legitimate access to an organisation's assets for unauthorised purposes. Interestingly there, it says their legitimate access. So it's not a definition that's wholly agreed everywhere else, because some other definitions do exist, which we will cover in a minute. And also, according to British Standard 16,000/2015, which is the Security Management Standard, in clause 8.8, it reminds us that perhaps the greatest security threat or potentially damaging threat to an organisation is from employees or people with access inside the organisation to its critical assets or information. Example, theft, fraud and malice. So again, those two at the minute, there is very much an intent there. However, if we look a little bit wider, insiders are also classed as those who have no conscious decision to act inappropriately. So when we looked at this figure here, if we looked on the left hand side, yes, malicious, which is very much what CPNI are telling us, and British Standard 16,000. But also if you look over to the right hand side, then we have accidental. So there's actually no motive to harm the organisation. So this is understandable when we think of information security. If you've lost your laptop or you lost your memory stick and there's information on there, well, you've accidentally breached security for the organisation. You could have lost a lot of data, but it's certainly not malicious. Potentially negligent, but then again, malicious could be negligent as well. But as we can see, if we keep an eye on that far right there, then it's understandable that could be accidental. I do remember from my military days the saying of loose lips sink ships. Also, we can look at some criminal groups. Now, I've taken this from the Security Handbook, from the first editions of the Security Handbook, and I can't remember who said it within the book, but ultimately they mentioned insiders, outsiders, and then also collusion between the two. So that's there, not specifically for insiders, but ultimately it does say insiders colluding with outsiders, and then the collusion between the two. That does give us three criminal groups, and I always like to remember those three when talking to clients. So I think that's worthy of being put in the slide. On the bottom left there, you can see an organisation called Verizon. Not sure, they're an American company, but they talk to us about malicious insiders. These are employees or partners who use their legitimate access to gain access to corporate data for personal gain. Inside agents, again malicious insiders, recruited by external parties to steal, alter, tamper with or delete valuable data. Thinking back to my time doing the close protection circuit, I remember being involved actually in an instance of an insider who was actually targeted the organisation on purpose, which was quite interesting. So it certainly fits that definition there. Disgruntled employees, very common. Emotional attackers can seek to harm the organisation as revenge for some sort of perceived wrong. Disgruntled employees is really big business in my understanding. Most people I think to are, and I talk to, are unhappy in work. It's certainly not a surprise. And disgruntled employees, they can quite easily leave your organisation, start up another organisation very similar to yours, and then before you know it, you're on the back foot because you've treated all your employees really badly, and then ultimately your employees are leaving you. I think somebody says people don't leave companies, they leave bad bosses. Interesting. Careless workers. So again, this is certainly not malice. Okay, so this hasn't been done intentional. So again, it does sort of call, the CPNI definition. It does. I'm not saying it goes dead against it, but ultimately, as you can see here, employees or partners who neglect or ignore the rules and organisation's cybersecurity policy. Very cyber, very information system security. These groups are here with Verizon. Third parties, so third-party vendors who misuse their access and compromise the security of sensitive data. So we've seen a couple of groups there. The costs. How much does the cost of insider threats? What was said in the Ponemon Institute Global Report? So the average global cost of insider threats rose by 31% in 2 years. So that's between 2018 and 2020. That rose to 11.45 million, with the frequency of incidents actually spiking by 47% in the same time period. So I think that's very, very interesting. When we think of health and safety risks, I'm sure there could be, we can look at the insider threat from those people who also don't follow the policies of the organisation. So I tend to think of this as more a benign threat, because it's not actually an intention a lot of the time, but more neglect. And if you think of Section 37 of the Act, of the Health and Safety Work Act, remember we've got neglect, we've also got connivance as well. Ignorance, we've got connivance in there, so that is worthy of thinking about. We're going to look now at a case study. So this gentleman on the right hand side, Andrew Skelton, he was jailed for 8 years because he was the malicious insider who leaked employees' sensitive data. Well, employees, 100,000 of them. And in 2017, the High Court in the UK gave a ruling because it actually was the first instance of vicarious liability being applied to a case of misuse of information. So, as it stood there, as you see on your screen, then Morrisons were going to be held vicariously liable. However, in 2020, after a major appeal, the UK Supreme Court overturned the High Court judgment for a maliciously motivated insider data breach. Even though that did get overturned, it cost Morrisons £2 million to rectify, or so they say. So it's worthy of remembering that case. So some confirmation of knowledge before we move on to the next section. So the CPNI, the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, defines an insider as a person who exploits or has the intention to exploit the legitimate access to an organisation's assets for unauthorised purposes. But we have to remember that an agreed single definition does not exist, because we do have those insiders who cause damage to the organisation unintentionally. Looking back to the costs, between 2018 and 2020, insider threats are reported to have risen by 31%, with the frequency also increasing of 47%. Remembering crimes can be committed by insiders, outsiders, or collusion between the two groups. And it's good to remember that Morrisons' insider threat cost them £2 million to clean up that mess. Obviously, that data breach, which was by a disgruntled employee who was an auditor, ultimately, if they'd have done more, potentially they may have been able to prevent that. On to security management. So on to the British Standard 16,000 2015, Security Management Strategic and Operational Guidelines. It's worthy of highlighting this standard. Within the standard, it says that security management is vitally important to strategic capability for a modern organisation that supports the achievement of the organisation objectives by protecting the organisation's reputation and financial well-being. So security management is very important. We know that. For those of us who have been involved in security for quite a long time, either directly involved or indirectly involved, as more so I am now with consulting and auditing, we always wanted to say how, we always thought, we always knew how important security was, but often to clients it's looked as an overhead. It's a cost. It's, as we know, it's the first thing to go sometimes. They think, well, we can get rid of security because we haven't had any incidents. Well, you may not have had any incidents because you have security, so we have to think like that. This British standard is really worth getting if you haven't got it. Indeed, as it goes on to say, beyond simply reacting to threats and risks, effective security management proactively supports both the capture and exploitation of opportunity and competitive or service delivery advantages. So it creates and it protects value. That is exactly the same for risk management in general. If we think of the purpose of risk management as in ISO 31000, it says it creates and protects value. So it can give us competitive edge. As a management discipline, it goes on to say that security management is best delivered when it follows a life cycle approach, sort of like a cradle to grave approach, as shown in figure 1, which we shall look at in a moment. I really like these diagrams. It really does help me visualize. So here is that life cycle approach as in 16,000 2015. So what is in the table of contents? How can we sort of marry them up? Understanding the organization's context. So right, number 3, 12 o'clock here. Within that clause there, we have external context, internal context, and deriving the requirements for security management. It's worth getting. Obviously, we can't share these, but the external context, what is going on outside the organization, when we think of the high-level structure of ISO, context is there, isn't it? External context, internal context. Then when we come on to clause 4, delivering the security framework. When we think of 31,000, we will look at that in a little bit. We have the principles, we have the framework, and we have the risk management process. The framework, what is a framework? Well, the framework, think of a tent. If a tent didn't have a framework, it's going to fall on the floor. So what holds the tent up? What holds the security up? What holds the risk up? What holds the health and safety up? That is the risk management framework within the organization, which is built of everything that the activities, the documentation, it's basically all the protocols that go on. That's the best way for me simply to think of the framework as basically the tent poles that holds the tent up. Within the framework, obviously commitment, mandate and commitment. As it's mentioned in your communication and awareness, well, we want to communicate and make people aware of insider risk, and we need to have the organizational structure, roles and responsibilities for doing that internally as well. Moving on then to security risk assessment. Everybody knows about the risk assessment. Less people sort of understand the wider process, the risk management process. Risk assessment being part of all of the risk management process, but what happens around it? So here, security risk assessment, asset identification, security threat and risk analysis. Then if you want, you can put those down into a risk register. Implementing security solutions. So as we can see, it's going on. This is iterative. It just goes on and on and on and on. Back to the start. Plan, do, check, act. So avoiding, transferring, eliminating, mitigating. Ultimately, you can see there very much risk management, isn't it? What do we do? What is our risk management approach? Are we going to avoid risk? Are we going to transfer it, eliminate it, mitigate it, tolerate it? Then remembering about exploiting it, going for it with risk management, because there is an upside to risk as well. Implementing the security program. This is where our policies come in, our security program across the organization, and then into security solutions. And we're nearly there with monitoring the security program and the solutions. But when we look through these clauses, it is when we come down into 8.8 personnel security, that's where the standard talks about the importance of ensuring that people coming into the organizations are vetted. We start to look at the security we start to look at the HR department, we start looking at the onboarding process, and what HR professionals like to term the employee life cycle. Exactly the same as health and safety. When people come in, are they safe to go to work? Do they have any pre-existing conditions like we were talking about in hazard identification? But what if those pre-existing conditions, I suppose, are the propensity to steal, to thieve, to commit acts of fraud? So ultimately, this is what that right at the very start, that layers of defence, just before people are joining the organisation, you need to be doing your background checks, your vetting in your onboarding process. Moving on. Then we've got monitoring the security program. Throughout here, we've got monitoring and reporting. Again, that forms part of ISO 31000, which we'll have a look at in a bit. But also revisiting the risks. The most important part of the assessment is the reassessment. That is for health and safety, that is for security risk, that is for first aid, isn't it? If you think of the first aid when you do your primary and your secondary surveys, we get told, and I tell people when I'm delivering, the most important part of the assessment is the reassessment, and that's the same for everything. It is an iterative cycle. Auditing, there you go. We had Tony this week, or yesterday I should say, on the Corporate Risk Essentials, and he mentioned auditing. He said yes, the nerds. Okay, we did have a little bit of a laugh about that. He knows how important auditing is, I should say. I love auditing, because when you audit, you get to look at all of this in organisations, and of course in your own organisation. And moving on, nearly there. Okay, so confirmation of knowledge for that section. British standard, we've just looked quickly at it. 16,000, 2015, it is a British standard specific to security management. The standard gives us that life cycle process to assist with embedding security management into an organisation. I love my frameworks. I find it much easier to follow a framework or a process when I see it written down like that. That's why you hear me going on regularly about the high level structure. The standard specifically highlights the risks from those who work inside the organisation. So very, very important there. Okay, and now on to a link to risk management. Here we're going to look now inside a threat, security risk management, ISO 31000. Inside a threat. So these are some slides taken from my 31000 slide deck. Clause 3 talks about terms and definitions, always important. So let's use those terms and definitions of risk from 31000, which tells us that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now I know people will say severity and likelihood, and that comes next, because this is a view from 30,000 foot. Now we've got to get into it. So a hold point, because we're going to dig now a little bit deeper into the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Note 120. An effect is a deviation from the expected. It can be positive, negative, or both, and can address, create, and result in opportunities and threats. So what are the objectives of the organisation? What are the objectives of your department? What are the objectives of the task that you're doing? If an effect is a deviation from that path, which could be positive or negative, it could result in opportunities and threats. But we've got to know exactly what we're doing first, and then if we deviate, is it positive, is it negative? So I like that note 120. Note 220, objectives can have different aspects and categories and can be applied at different levels. In ISO, when we're looking for undertaking our audits, they say objectives should be set at areas within the organisation, basically strategic, tactical, and operational. So objectives are set everywhere. If you're not familiar with MBO, management by objectives, that's worth looking at. I suppose most of us are familiar with SMART objectives. Those are the objectives that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Again, if you don't know where you're going, any road is going to get you there. We must know our objectives. Think about that uncertainty. There are different types of uncertainty. Yesterday we were talking about linguistic uncertainty. That is uncertainty due to the way we speak. We could say, oh yes, Andy is old. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in there. I'm not saying I'm not old, but am I talking about me? So that's it. So risk management, security management, communications management, very important. Linguistic uncertainty. I haven't put it on the slides, it just come to me. Have a look at that if you get a chance. The last note 20, risk is usually expressed in terms of risk sources, potential events, their consequences, and their likelihood. So there you go. For all of us who also like the definition of risk, including consequences and likelihood, it is in there. It's just the ISO 31000 definition comes up a little bit higher and focuses us on objectives. I'm now going to mention the big three. This again is another slide from the 31000 course that is being built. Principles, then we have the framework, and then we have the process. So when we look at those three, do they interact? Yes, they do. Principles right at the very top. The principles, why do we need to know the principles of risk management? Because if we don't know them, we will not be able to tell if they are not embedded into an organization. So it's very important. We'll have a look at those a little bit deeper as we go on. I just wanted to show you the big three. When we put the 31000, when we finalize the 31000, it will be big three, big three, big three. Talk me through the principles, talk me through the framework, talk me through each and every part of the risk management process. Very important, the big three. And that is certainly going to link into security risk management and insider threat. It's going to link into environmental, it's going to link into HR and health and safety as well, of course. Let's have a look at those principles. I've just pulled one or two out which do link very much so with insider threat. So when we come to principle 7, human and cultural factors. Human behaviour and culture significantly influence all aspects of risk management at each level and stage. That certainly applies to insider risk. I'm just going to fly off my screen now, and I'm going to look through into the where we are here. Let's have a look. Insider risk. I'll go a little bit deeper into that in a second. I just want to find embedding security. This is the one. I want to find this because this is embedding security using the 5 E's. So we will talk about this on one or two of the next slide. This is all about behavior. So this is a 19-page document from, again, the CPNI. If you've not seen it, please please get onto their website and have a look at it, even though this is obviously supposedly to be specific for national infrastructure. Ultimately, we can take little bits from it and make up our own eclectic risk management, security management framework. So this document really is worth looking at. Okay, moving on. So embedding the security behaviours. That's a document we just looked at. It is a framework for improving security behaviour within organisations. Again, that term, framework, it is something we can look at. So if we got it, if it's written down, if it's documented, we can follow it. Without frameworks, everything else is ad hoc. So frameworks are important. The 5 E's, educate. We've got to educate our staff on insider risk, educate our staff on security in general, whether that's physical, whether that's information, whether that's cyber, of course. Enable, we've got to enable them. We've got to make sure that they have the tools in order to do what they need to do. Shaping the environment, encouraging the action, endorsed by credible sources. That is telling us that when our staff are listening to us, ultimately they need to think, yes, that is coming from a credible source. And then we've got to evaluate the impact. Always the same. Plan, do, check, act. Continual improvement in the high level structure. Guidelines. Because we're linking this to 31000, we've mentioned frameworks as we've been going along. But again, we've taken a slide from 31000. How can we link this through? So here's the slide. This is actually the design phase I've chosen to look at in the framework. Okay, the components, all built off leadership and commitment, integration, and then design. So let's look at the design, because in this part of ISO 31000, this is where you are designing the framework for risk management within the organization. Because it's risk management, underneath that it is security risk management. Because it's security risk management, it is insider threat, health and safety, environment, quality, HR as well, of course. So again, we have that context. So we must understand the context of the organization before we can design any framework. We've got to articulate risk management. We can swap that. We've got to articulate security management throughout the organisation. We've got to assign roles, authorities, responsibilities and accountabilities for security and for insider risk management, whether that's our whether that's our insider threat program, our insider risk assessments, the person who's responsible for undertaking this, allocating the resources. That's obviously going to be the time, going to be the equipment, it's going to be the training, and then we've got to establish communication and consultation. Communication and consultation is throughout everything we do in an organisation. Without that, we ain't going to get anywhere, are we? Very, very important. So where else can we see this? Where else can we link security into 31,000? The process, the risk management process. In my opinion, the most important part of the big three: the principles, the process, the framework. But most people just think about the process, and ultimately most people only think of a tiny part of the process. So let's look at that process. Again, these are slides taken from the 31,000 course. Communication and consultation. Actually, what are we looking at? We are looking at the risk management process. I'd like you to think of these as risk management activities. These are the activities. The purpose of the actual process is to embed risk management into the company. So look at the process. Communication and consultation. The scope, context and criteria. Here I want us to focus on the context, because if we were talking about health and safety, then all this would now apply to health and safety and HR. But no, it's not. It's talking about security now, and inside that security we're talking about insider threat, insider risk. So the context and the criteria. We're going to move on. And here comes the risk assessment process. We could be calling this the security risk assessment process, where we identify those threats, we analyze those threats, and then we evaluate the threats against the criteria of the actual risk assessment, risk management context that we're talking about. That's where the criteria comes in. Very, very important. If this was for health and safety, and the actual context and the scope and the criteria were concerned with hand and arm vibration syndrome, then ultimately all the criteria that comes in from the HSE, whether it's the approved code of practice L140, when we're looking at the ready reckoner, we're looking at our trigger times, we're looking at our vibration magnitudes, lower and upper, and this is it. That's the context. That's the criteria. That's why we can apply anything to this, working off that. Then we have the treatment. So we've done our risk assessment, then what treatment are we going to do? Remember, these are all activities. Monitoring and review. Once we've done that security risk assessment, of course, we need to monitor it, and then we need to review it. Review comes after monitor. So review could be at certain times. We've got to look at those times, we've got to think of those times. We've also got recording and reporting. And if you're wondering why none of these are actually in steps, it's because the process is iterative. The real benefit of ISO 31000-2018, I feel, is the way this diagram is depicted. Because we undertake the risk management process, which this is, when we're communicating and consulting. We undertake the risk management process when we're monitoring and reviewing, when we're recording and reporting. So many people just focus on the risk assessment part. They don't focus on the management part. This is the risk managed. To manage it, we have to ensure all of these are in play. Some confirmation of knowledge from that section. So British Standard, we looked at that. It gives us a life cycle process which assists with embedding security management into an organisation. But we also then looked at the principles, framework and process, i.e. the big three of 31,000, because they can also assist in security risk management, also in health and safety risk management, and so on and so forth. By having the 31,000 of the overarching method for embedding risk management, we can then use 16,000 to do that security element within it. So everything is risk management. That is holistic. This is our enterprise risk management across the board. 27,000 information system security can fall underneath it. So can compliance. That's why it's important to try and separate those out in your mind. The 5 E's is a CPNI, the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, framework for improving security behaviour within organisations. Insider threat programme. We can look at Homer, not Simpson, or we can look at risk assessments, and we're also going to have a look at the maturity model. Before I actually go into look at the holistic management of employee risk, I just want to jump back into the insider risk area within the CPNI website. Look how fantastic this is, and updated. Some of the documentation here is quite old, but a lot of the stuff that's written in here is new. So insider risk, people are an organization's biggest asset. However, in some cases they can also pose an insider risk. We looked at the different groups, didn't we? Insiders, outsiders, and those who collude. We also looked at how the CPNI focus quite a lot on intent, on intent, whereas when we think of it in a wider context, it could just be negligence, and these could be accidents, it could be tired personnel, of course. We have an insider risk mitigation framework, personnel security maturity, which we'll come on to in a moment. But yes, look at all this fantastic information that we have in here. If you're not familiar with the website, yep, you really, really should be. Okay. Holistic management of employee risk. For those of you who haven't seen this is some guidance, yet again, which sets out the principles, the policies and the procedures which are necessary for managing the risk that employees' behaviour will damage their organisation. I can't not say this enough. Disgruntled employees, for me, they are the biggest risk. And that is the biggest risk that leaders and owners and managers can actually control. Just stop being the type of people that upset people. Just don't do it. Change yourself, because the more you upset people, the more you are bringing in that inequitable relationships. And I've been there. Most people in PCR Global and the new people that are going to come into PCR Global have been there with other companies. We share that. We understand it, and it's not good. Personnel security. Personnel security. When we think about security, information system security, we then think of physical security, we think of emotional security, car security, travel security, personnel security. This is where it's at. Personnel security is a system of policies and procedures that seek to manage the risk of people exploited or having the intention to exploit the legitimate access to an organisation's assets for unauthorised purposes. And as we know, those who seek to exploit the legitimate access are termed insiders. So what do we have to do? We have to use appropriate personnel security measures to help us prevent or deter a wide variety of insider attacks, from staff fraud through to the facilitation or conduct even of a terrorist attack. Very important. The personnel risk assessment. We'll jump back onto the CPNI website in a moment. Personnel security risk assessments. Very rare do I see these done to any degree of deep focus, and they are so important. They get done a lot in terms of when people talk about things, and they may put a couple of things in place, but we don't spend enough time on this. This should be one big focus. Really important. Personnel security risk assessments. Focus on employees. That's it. Their access, their organisation's assets. So proximity. That's what they focus on. The actual proximity. What they've got access to. How close are they to it? How often they've got access to it? Who is watching the watchers? Very important. They look at the risks they could pose and the adequacy of existing countermeasures. A personnel security risk assessment is crucial in helping security and human resources, i.e. HR managers, and other people involved in strategic risk decisions to communicate to senior managers the risks to which the organisation is exposed. By undertaking the security risk assessment, we are then able to document it. We've thought it through, we've identified the threats, we've looked at the weaknesses, we've looked at the vulnerabilities, we've looked at the opportunities, we've worked out what can go wrong and what can happen. Then we can pass that information up. I don't see I've not seen a HR department do this, if I'm brutally truthful with you. It is worth doing though. The potential steps in a personnel security risk assessment would be, we would need to identify the critical assets in the organisation. This could be servers, this could be information, it could be anything. Again, we have to sit down, it's specific to the context of our organisations. We identify the threat. The threat we'll be looking at will be based on the intent and the capability. So somebody might have intent, they might not have capability. They might have capability, they might not have intent. This is why we have to think about this, and we have to monitor the individuals internally. Once we've identified the threat, we assess the likelihood. We're back to that likelihood, and we're looking at the consequences, which is assessing the impact to the business if that threat is realised. We then need to review the adequacy of our existing countermeasures. So we're sort of looking at the probability of attack, we're looking at the probability of identifying it, of being notified, so the probability of detection, and then we're looking at the probability of neutralisation as well. Can we neutralise that threat? That all gives us that end result threat picture. We've built it all up. Now we know, now we can review the adequacy of our existing countermeasures. And if we need to, we can then propose new, which must be proportionate, measures to reduce security risks. Very often these things get overcooked. When they get overcooked, then we end up with a little bit too much, and then security starts constraining everything. We understand that security must sort of constrain certain things, but ultimately we need to ensure the organisation can breathe. The organisation must be able to prosper. Really important. What the CPNI tell us is that these risk assessments can be done at the organisational level, they can be at the group or the business unit level, I would suppose, or at the actual individual level. If we're thinking in a close protection, high net worth context, who has access? So very important. I can remember doing these ones myself, and think of your principal. Who spends most time with the principal? That could be your nannies, it could be the cleaners, it could be butlers, of course, right? Anybody who is spending that time, who has access to your principal's food? Think about that, the food. When they get access to the food, then something's going in somebody's mouth. I think I'm remembering it was the owner of Body Shop who, I believe there was an insider attack from, I could be wrong, I think something's in my head. It was the owner of Body Shop a long time ago now, but I'm sure it was one of the chefs. Very, very important to think about that. Insider risk mitigation framework. We'll have a look at this in a minute. It's much easier for me to show you than what it is for me to explain it. But the CPNI, they recommend an insider threat program. When I do my security audits, I focus on this. Let's talk insider threats. Some of the organisations I've supported in the past now really have solid insider threat programs. Everybody is aware of it, and remembering, awareness itself can be a deterrent. If we implement a threat, an insider threat program, this will facilitate an objective review of the security posture and allow measures to be updated or deployed in a risk-based manner. So part of that insider threat program we're talking about, is the insider risk mitigation framework. We also look at the risk maturity framework to see exactly where we are. This is what this mitigation framework looks like with CPNI, and I might as well just jump straight onto the website to have a look at it. So let's have a look here. Monitoring and assessment. So here we can see for the Homer we have loads of information we can download. The inside data collection study is quite an old study, but it is worth looking through. What we have here, reducing insider risk again. This talks us about the personnel security, and here we go. We have the mitigation framework. Now, when we click on this, I think this is really good. Once we click into it, it then takes us into the framework, and then ultimately we can follow on board governance right at the very top. We can click into that. We can go a little bit further if we need to read more, and there we go. This now talks about board engagement. When we teach the IOSH Corporate Risk Essentials, this is all about risk from the board. So if you've been on that course, it's worth following this and have a look in here. It just gives us a links back through as well. Here's the personnel security maturity module as well. So it really is worth going onto this framework to have a look. Insider threat practitioners, read more. Then we get to the role-based security risk assessments. Then we look at how do we implement our mitigations, whether they're physical and technical, how we do our investigations and our disciplinary procedures, when we would need to monitor and review, our SEATS program, our security education and training system. The SEATS program, very important. Policies, standards, guidelines and procedures. Lots of policies and procedures. The ACES have a number as well, which is really good. And look at that then, employee screening and vetting, which we've been talking about. And also communications, security culture, very important. If we go into there, we can see a security culture climate tool as well. And of course, we have continual improvement. So really worth looking at that in the flesh, wasn't it? So moving on, we're nearly there now. I just mentioned the Corporate Risk Essentials framework, and as we can see, risk governance, just mentioned governance, risk identification, assessment, mitigation, monitoring, continuous improvement. All these frameworks are very similar. Note, identifying security risks forms part of recognized risk management frameworks. Very much like the IOSH one, very much like obviously ISO 31000. Remember, security is one spoke. Health and safety is as well. Often put in a silo, but if we look at enterprise risk management, we are looking at them all. Now we're on to the PerSec. So it's the personal security maturity model, which we will have a look at now in a little bit more detail. And the model is based on 7 core elements of effective personnel security processes, which have been identified by the CPNI through their insider data study. 7 core elements. What are they? Governance and leadership, insider risk assessment, pre-employment screening, ongoing personnel security, monitoring and assessment of employees. Monitoring is ongoing, remember. Investigation and disciplinary, and then security culture and behavioural change. I think we're there. Confirmation of knowledge. 16,000 provides a life cycle process. We've seen that. It is a very good document, really worth looking at. 31,000 also can assist in security management, as we've seen. The big 3. We'll look at the big 3: principles, framework and processes. And the risk management process, I should say. The 5 E's. Remember the 5 E's, which is the CPNI framework for improving security behaviour change within organisations. A lot of talk gets done about health and safety behaviour, security behaviour. It's exactly the same. Not much talk gets done about that. And then the CPNI personnel security maturity model, which has 7 core sections. So that is it. A personal thank you from me. Thank you very much. Insider threat, insider risk is very personal to me. I feel like I've been that insider on a number of occasions. I feel like I know a couple of insiders currently, and I can tell you now that is down to the way the organisation is led. Misleaders. If you're a boss and you're watching this and you treat your employees with disdain, well, you are sowing the seeds of your own crisis. That is just a fact. What else would you expect? Insider threat, very, very important. Thank you very much. I know all our time is valuable. Thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with me. Really good. A module I've really enjoyed putting together today. So that's it. It really is that simple. the knowledge we have and the decisions we make really can keep people safe and protect organisations as well. Today's letter was I, and the subject was insider threat.